Good morning. My name is Joanna Quinn, and I teach at the University of Western Ontario. I'm so pleased to welcome you all here this morning as a member of the conference organizing committee to the first full day of our Pathways to Reconciliation conference. Now, as I told you, I'm from Ontario, and so I had a conversation the other night with two friends, and I asked them about the traditional peoples who lived here and still live here. And in thinking about how to start this morning's session, I said to them, this stuff is important, and I just don't want us to screw this up again. And one of those friends said to me, and that's how we're going to get to reconciliation. Now, the Forks were the traditional meeting place for the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, Dakota, Saulteaux, and the birthplace of the Métis Nation. And I want to acknowledge that we stand on Treaty 1 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. What I hope is that this session will really kick off a whole day of important conversations about the obligations of non-Indigenous Canadians to our Indigenous friends as part of the promises we made in those treaties and the commitments we've made since that time. I want to acknowledge the elders and the survivors and our distinguished guests who are with us here today. And I also want to recognize the non-Indigenous people who have come for whom reconciliation is also a priority. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce now the very Reverend Elder Stan McKay. Reverend McKay was born at Fisher River First Nation Reserve, a Cree community in northern Manitoba. And as a young person, Stan attended the Fisher River Indian Day School and the Bertle Indian Residential School. In 1971, he graduated from here at the University of Winnipeg, and he was ordained by the United Church of Canada, and he became a pastor. He's the former moderator of the United Church, and he's the first Aboriginal person to have led a mainline Protestant denomination in Canada. Stan has done considerable work around conversations of reconciliation, and it's really an honor to have him here with us this morning to offer greetings and prayers and to start us off in a good way. So please join me in welcoming Stan this morning. I have a small gift of tobacco that I'm going to give to Stan.
Dan sendu temitik. Imenogisiga ga se mamuya. Papas kwimistus kamos tetens negason. Utsegisi pintussin. Ego misetto en mamtenente en ista. Omagatos kattamaag. Ta mamujatus kiaag. Sagi uimenig. Ta ussi miskamaag miskanau. Ego manos kagisigag. Inaas komunista ga se mamujaag. I grew up in the Interlake of this province, just north of here. And I wanted to tell you this morning that 120 years ago, my grandparents, both my grandparents on my maternal side, spent many years in a residential school, 120 years ago. 60 years ago, I went to the residential school. And so it is significant that we gather in this time of revolution, liberation, which is for all peoples. This land on which we meet, Manitoba, in our language means the resting place of the Creator. So we've known from time immemorial that this is sacred land. Kanatanu maski, kanatanipi. The earth and the land are sacred. And all the life on this land is sacred. And so we say in the lodge, Kachinau inwacho maganak, all of my relations. So when we talk about what reconciliation might mean, I hope that at some point our dialogue will wander slightly over to the inclusion of all life, of the water and the land and all of the creatures and life on this planet. This is a good day because we have an international component to today's gathering. Mamawi is the Cree word for together, to work together. And this conference is a wonderful example of the balance between women and men, between different cultures, different peoples, coming together to learn how to be fully human with each other. In 1948, there was the release of the Universal Declaration of the Rights, of Human Rights, from the United Nations, and that has had almost no impact on Indigenous peoples in this territory, and I imagine on many other territories. The Declaration of Human Rights, in my reading, is primarily a individualistic document, the rights of individuals. Well, in 2007, the release of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was accepted by the United Nations, by most nations. Some did not catch the idea. But the idea of today's gathering, I think, captures much of that inclusion of all peoples. The Indigenous peoples declare rights in community, in extended family, in Indigenous nationhood, and we want to be inclusive in the conversation. So the wisdom of the TRC to include the United Nations Declaration as part of what it is to be reconciled is significant. My favorite passage, article in the United Nations Declaration of the Right of Indigenous Peoples is number 25. So when you want to have an earnest conversation, just look at your neighbor and say, Article 25. That'll be enough. It's really about connection to the land. Connection to the land, our sacred lands, sacred sites, and how that is maintaining individual and community rights, nationhood. So this day I'm going to give thanks. I learned from the elders that the primary action of human community is to acknowledge with thanksgiving the gift of life. Those who are able, I invite you to take a moment to stand and place your feet on the earth. Ag se man tu e pena nask moach, I se mamu yaach. Gabis ga megian bemat tisuin. Gabis e mam tenente mach, mes gau gami asik. Pe sa weni menan, sa weni menan, sa weni menan, sa weni menan. Ego se. Oh.
As Stan alluded to, one of the things that we thought a lot about as we put together the various parts of this conference was the experience of other countries that have gone through processes of reconciliation and that are attempting to come to terms with legacies of abuse and harm. Those experiences, I think, are useful to us here in Canada, and in thinking about the many pathways to reconciliation that we can pursue now that we have the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in hand. And so with that thought in mind, we've invited two people from very different backgrounds and who've experienced very different takes on reconciliation to join us, Régine King and Justin Mohammed. Now, our first important guest is Professor Régine King, who now teaches at the University of Manitoba in the Faculty of Social Work. Dr. King is a survivor of the genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994. She worked as a coordinator and facilitator of a trauma healing program through World Vision Rwanda, bringing together Hutu and Tutsi, victim and perpetrator. She moved to Canada in 2000, where she worked as a mental health counselor and a public speaker. She has written widely about survivors of organized violence, including refugees and those who resettle where the violence occurred, social inequities, cross-cultural mental health interventions, and approaches to forgiveness and reconciliatory processes. She holds a PhD from Factor Intinwash Faculty of Social Work and a Master of Education in Counseling, Psychology, and Community Development from the University of Toronto. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Régine King?
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. It's a great honor for me to be here this morning talking to you about my country of origin, Rwanda. And thank you for your interest in this topic of Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In the next few minutes, I will be sharing experiences and lessons that we can learn from Rwanda and through its Truth Commission known as Gacaca. But I want to acknowledge that now I live in the beautiful Manitoba on Treaty 1 territory over the last 4 years. I have been in Canada for almost now 16 years, since 2000. I spent in my first 12 years in Toronto, and the last 4 years have been in Manitoba, and they have been very precious and very meaningful to me personally and to me as a Rwandan Canadian. So as Joanna stated, I also stand here as a survivor of the Tutsi genocide in Rwanda, which took place in '94. In only 100 days, about 1 million of Tutsi and some moderate Hutus who tried to protect them were murdered, not by strangers, but people who were former neighbors and friends. I also stand here as a social work researcher who got interested in issues of post-genocide processes, especially the concepts of trauma healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation. As a Rwandan Canadian, I am very aware and I am learning so much about the negative impacts colonization has had, not only on my birth country of Rwanda, but also on Aboriginal people of Canada. I find myself sometimes appalled that actually the two countries that now I call home have gone through genocides. In Rwanda, it was a mass massacre of the Tutsi people. In Canada, I'm very sure those who were here last night and heard about the stories of children being sent to residential schools and died there, but we are also very aware of the core cultural genocide, which destroys not only the physical being, but the soul and mind of people. So today we are considering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada, but it is also in the context of that dual identity of mine and the personal curiosity that I will be sharing with you the experiences from Gacaca in Rwanda. For those who don't know about Rwanda, I will ask you to go and read. The history is quite long, but I want to focus on post-genocide. As I mentioned, only in 100 days, about 1 million of people lost their lives at the hands of their neighbors. It was a state-sponsored genocide. But when the genocide ended, we were all wounded and disoriented, physically, psychologically, and destitute. Houses had been destroyed. Forsakes and souvenirs had been taken away, and people didn't know exactly what to do to move forward. So as we were talking about 1 million of people lost only in 3 months, we had about 1 million of Tutsi, former refugees who fled the country in early 60s, who returned to the country in masses because they lived for more than 3 decades in neighboring countries, and they could hardly wait to return to a country they called home. But that country was no longer the country they dreamed of. As they were coming to Rwanda, we experienced almost at the same time about 2 million of Hutus fleeing the country because of the fear of retaliation of what the new government was going to do, especially to the perpetrators and their families. We were in a country where about 250,000 Tutsi women had been raped, sometimes by many men and gangs of perpetrators, and many of whom had been infected with the virus of HIV, so that if they don't die through the genocide, they will die slowly of the disease. We lived in a country where 13% of the population of Rwandan households were headed by children who had been orphaned through the genocide, and some of them who were household headers were as young as 10 years of age because they didn't have any more families to take them in. We lived in a country that was quite chaotic. 2 years later, that was in '96, there was a massive repatriation of Hutu who had lived for 2 years in refugee camps. We don't have statistics of how many of Hutus who might be innocent or perpetrators who were killed on the way to refugee camps or in those camps because the violence continued. We don't know how many women were raped. But one thing I witnessed as we were welcoming back those refugees, girls who were at least 12 years of age had babies of their own on their backs. So by '96, in a country where jails only had the capacity to host 10,000 prisoners, were hosting more than 20,000 men and women genocide suspects. So it was a kind of another form of disaster. There was a genocide, there was this whole mixture of people coming in and leaving the country, but at the same time, there had been a genocide and people were to be held accountable. So at the time, Rwanda had many questions. Previous to the genocide, Rwanda was known as a country of 1,000 hills, and that's very true. You can move from the lowest valleys to the highest volcanoes. Rwanda was known for its beauty of all the time. Rwanda, after the genocide, became known as a country of 1,000 problems, and we didn't know how to go about them. One Rwandan psychologist, who is kind of my mentor, Simon Gasibirege, expressed it in this way. How is it possible to live together in peace and security when neighbors have killed the parents or siblings from the household next door? How can social harmony be rebuilt when one group blames another for war, for exile, and lost years in refugee camps and prisons? How can we conceptualize and implement reconciliation, peace building, and sustainable development projects in a society that is imploded, disoriented, and reduced to chaos. We were all asking ourselves those questions. But in addition to this chaos, there was one big question for Rwandans and non-Rwandans within the international community. It was a question about justice. How to bring to justice the perpetrators of the genocide. The genocide was known as an intimate genocide because people actually didn't die, many people didn't die of gunshots. They died of machetes and clubs at the hands of their neighbors, the people they knew and lived together in a previous life. So, but Rwanda, the Rwandan genocide was no longer that tribal war between the African barbaric people. It had an international component to it. Many of you must have witnessed it from your living rooms on TV. While the genocide was taking place, UN and the other rich countries were actually not concerned about the lives of Rwandans. They were concerned whether that could be called a genocide. So for all those 100 days, they were debating on the name of what it could be. Was it a genocide? Was it a tribal war? So the Rwandan genocide was beyond the Rwandan borders. So there were some actions taken. By November 94, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda was established and was to function from Arusha in Tanzania. The Rwandan national courts, which were supposedly in existence, they were not functional. There were a very, very few judges and who were ill-equipped to deal with issues of genocide. The national courts opened its doors in '96 as those prisons were overcrowded by men and women who couldn't even fit in places where they were being placed. But by '99, many Rwandans realized that actually, if we go through the formal legal system, internationally or nationally, we were not going to ever come to justice. So Rwanda started looking for alternatives, and that's when Gacaca was born. Gacaca literally means lawn, because it used to be a traditional mechanism that involved Rwandans to sit on the lawn and debate and resolve their disputes. It was quite weakened during the Rwandan independence as it was being replaced by the formal national courts, the legal system, but it remains in existence informally to continue to bring people together to resolve some of their conflicts. So the process of Gacaca traditionally involved an offender to confess the wrong done, to ask for forgiveness, and then to share a drink or food at the end of the session as a way of reconciliation. And that ritual happened between the offender and the offended, and usually they will be called to come and embrace, shake hands, and admit that what happened was not going to be repeated. So after the genocide, the renewed Gacaca was actually launched by 2002, but it had a different mandate. It was to judge and reconcile. It was retributive and restorative at the same time. But borrowing from its traditional approach, the renewed Gacaca encouraged suspects of the genocide to confess either before the trials or bring that confession to the public during the Gacaca trials. And if they did that, they were given a chance to give details of the crimes committed to indicate where the bodies of those who were killed were thrown, so that the survivors can have a chance to rebury the remains of their loved ones. And on that condition, they will receive either a reduced sentence, or the sentence will be replaced by community work, and in some cases, they will just be forgiven and only be asked to repair material stuff, like the properties that were destroyed. So Gacaca was quite embraced by many Rwandans, because those who were in jails, they thought that actually that was a way for them to come forward. And some of them who were feeling guilty, they were given a chance to actually confess while in prison, and then come out and state what they did during the genocide. The renewed Gacaca was led not by lawyers, but locally elected community members who were known to have some kind of integrity, especially if they were not suspected for genocide crimes, and they were over 18 years of age, and they had lived in the same communities for at least a few years. So the Rwandan Gacaca courts or trials were led not by lawyers, but regular people, like you and me. They didn't want to rely on the experts, because the experience from the Criminal Tribunal Court of Arusha or the national courts were actually not giving role models that could be followed. But since the implementation of Gacaca, there have been many criticisms of Gacaca. The evaluations have been very controversial and mixed. Some scholars, those who are able to write and publish, they have actually, some of them, they think that Gacaca had a very good reception among Rwandans, and they felt that actually participating in Gacaca would unburden Rwandans of atrocities they had committed or suffered. But there was another body of literature, of scholars, who argued that Gacaca violated the principle of fair trials, that it was state-controlled, that it was one-sided victor justice, simply because it focused on the crimes committed during the genocide, not the crimes committed before 94 or after 94, especially when there were cases of revenge. So there are many people who have criticized the Gacaca for that. But these controversies might be due to varying expectations that different people had about Gacaca. They might be due to their different professional backgrounds. I guess as a social worker, I think of justice differently than someone who may be a lawyer or a political scientist. And we have those views in the existing literature. But they may also be due to individual experiences and the media reports. I think we get very highly influenced by media. But what I would say to these different perspectives and expectations of Gacaca is that they often fail to locate their assessments and evaluations in the context in which Gacaca was operating. It would be so naive, for instance, to imagine that Gacaca was that one restorative justice that could handle issues of genocide. But I think it would also be equally naive and unrealistic to imagine that Gacaca could meet all legal rights of the offender and the offended. There is kind of a fine line between the legality and the reconciliatory aspects of truth commissions. I give you an example that is very close to home. During the genocide, my young brother Theonest was called to testify. No, he was cut with machetes during the genocide and left for dead. After the genocide, during Gacaca, he was called to testify at Gacaca hearings. So there were two people involved. A woman who shouted at him when he was trying to find refuge behind her house during the genocide. When she shouted, the killers discovered him and attacked him with machetes and clubs. They inflicted wounds on his head, on his chest, that actually his tendons were cut so that he will never be able to walk again. After the genocide, after he gave his testimony, the woman didn't have time to defend herself. She just moved forward and kneeled down. This is in the public, with all the community people, the villagers gathered. She kneeled down and asked for his forgiveness. She had done that right after the genocide to my mother, but she didn't think that it was sufficient. She wanted to make it public and obtain his forgiveness publicly, which she did. But the other guy, the one who had headed the group that attacked him with machetes, denied the accusations, denied that actually he didn't know my brother at all, that he never seen that guy, that the story he's sharing is not true. So when I asked, I was living in Canada at the time, I asked my brother how it went, how the trial went. This is what he told me. I went to Gacaca with mercy on my two hands. One wanted it, asked for it, and I gave it to her. One didn't want it, he never asked for it, and I took it back. So even at that personal level, you can imagine, it's so difficult to think of forgiving someone who cut you with machetes and left you dead, naked. But he was willing to give that forgiveness. But the guy instead didn't want it. So he was accused of other crimes in the village, and he was sentenced to 19 years of jail time. So Rwandans and the world in general had high standards about Gacaca. While Gacaca didn't meet all of them and presented some failures in the heavy mandate it was entrusted, it was able to fill the gaps that only a truth commission can do. I'll give you an example. Gacaca tried far more people than the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha, and at a very, very low budget. It cost the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda $1.5 billion to complete only 75 cases in a period of 18 years. It only cost Gacaca $15 million to complete cases, more than 2 million of genocide cases over a period of 10 years. While for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, it costed to complete only one case. It cost the International Criminal Tribunal Court for Rwanda $20 million for one case. It cost Gacaca only $50. So if Rwandans were to rely on the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the National Courts for Justice, Many people would have died of old age before being prosecuted or receiving justice. So with all its limitations, I judge Gacaca personally to have been efficient and transformative. There are a few lessons from Gacaca that I think that maybe as Canadians we can consider as we seek to implement the TRC recommendations. One thing I have learned from this whole process of Gacaca is that the formal legal system on its own was very incapable of rendering justice and reconciliation to the people of Rwanda. I assume that there are many Aboriginal people in Canada. If they have to wait for the formal legal justice to be rendered, maybe they will be dead before they see it happening. Rwandans chose Gacaca pathways because they were caught up between that illegality of genocide crimes and a divided nation. Gacaca provided an opportunity to bring together the members of the two groups involved in the genocide. It facilitated the hearings with a legal component to it, but these hearings took place in local communities with everyone gathered. The witnesses shared their testimonies publicly. The presumed offenders had an opportunity to admit their deeds, confess, ask for forgiveness, receive it, or have it denied. But all of that was done publicly. So they both had a chance. So this process of coming together provided a framework and a forum in which Hutus and Tutsi were to deal with genocide-related issues. But afterwards, this Gacaca process and bringing people together, back together, has also created a forum from which other work can be done, especially when you are dealing with issues of poverty, issues of continued violence, domestic violence. As Rwandans, we realize that you can't just do it without bringing the offender, the offended together, the people who are concerned back together at the same table. So, but what we know is that many truth commissions have been implemented mostly in the countries of the South, right? In Chile, in Rwanda. South Africa is not a developed country. We are very lucky to have our brother here from Australia, but many of the truth commissions have happened over there. So actually, many people wonder, what does Truth and Reconciliation Commission has to do with Canada? Internationally, Canada is known as a relatively peaceful country. Our leaders are democratically elected. But as Rosemary Nagy, I don't know if she's here. I'm going to cite you. So she says something that is very profound, that Canada has an inside story that goes beyond the weight of the lawsuits and the worldwide popularity of truth commissions. True. So we kind of live in a country that is very divided. Aboriginal people have fought against many injustices. They suffered at the hands of the settlers for more than a century now. Yet, many Canadians didn't perceive the need to join Aboriginal people in this fight. In fact, many continue to tell us that they didn't know the ordeals that Aboriginal people have gone through. That's very sad. I guess for those who were here last night and followed Cindy's presentation, it's not that we don't have answers. Maybe sometimes we just choose to look away. So one thing I think that we can learn from at least Gacaca, from that faraway country, is the urge to find ways to come together, like the way we have started doing it now, to dialogue together about these issues that affect our brothers and sisters from indigenous communities, to bring us together as Canadians, to be honest with each other about those issues that divide us. The second point I want to end on is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, in most cases, they wanted to hold the governments and citizens responsible for the injustices committed in a particular time. Engaging communities doesn't mean exonerating concerned governments from their responsibilities to acknowledge the harm done, compensate the victims, and support policies that promote justice and equality. But the involvement of the government as an institution doesn't take away individual and community responsibilities to seek the welfare of all Canadians, Aboriginal people of Canada included. There is one thing that Gacaca allowed to happen in Rwanda. You will not hear of this most often in the existing literature and the debates, but it has held a few people accountable, including international guys. It's the fight against genocide ideology. Gacaca has alerted Rwandans to not tolerate forms of language or behaviors for those who try to minimize or deny the genocide. I was in Rwanda this past month, and a local government officer was quite in hot waters because a group of community people, local people, reported a case of someone who was dehumanizing one survivor because he found her crying and grieving for the people she lost to the genocide in '94. They reported him, and the local official refused kind of to follow up or do something about it. When she didn't, they went to the next level and talked that actually she has heard about it, and she has refused to do anything about it. So one thing that is happening in Rwanda is kind of that sense of thinking that I am responsible to hold my next door neighbor accountable of dehumanizing language or acts, and they say that if you go missing, I am responsible for your being missed. So it's a new dynamic that Gacaca has created in Rwanda. Holding each other accountable will only be possible in our context of Canada. And I want to say this. Canadians have started holding some political candidates and public figures accountable through the media. That's very good. But I think we need to do more of it, especially when Aboriginal people are concerned. Holding each other accountable will not be possible when we each condone stereotypes, prejudice, and other marginalizing behaviors that we witness and choose to look away, that we read about and choose to ignore. Holding each other accountable requires us first to listen and learn from one another. But it also requires us to take the risk. In one of the classes I teach at the University of Manitoba, I get to discuss issues of privilege and oppression with my students. Some of my Caucasian students admit that they often hear racist comments from close family members. That's very good when they admit that. But after some time, so I get to ask them, so now as you know, when you hear the same comments, what do you do about them? Some of them are like, it's so hard to take the risk, but some others, they actually say that I remain silent because I don't want to make my family members feel uncomfortable. So holding each other accountable requires taking the risk. Sometimes to feel uneasy, to feel uncomfortable, and sometimes to pay the cost for it. So I want to say that actually reconciliation in terms of money, in terms of gacaca, we can just say it was a cheap approach to do justice. But actually, reconciliation can be very, very costly. Listening to personal stories of genocide, of residential school, of reserves, of marginalization, of perpetration, of crimes, they quite create, doing that create very strong emotions. At the same time, it's the only way they can bring a human element to inhumane acts when we show that we have listened and we have understood and we have done something about it. Taking the risk to hold others accountable may cost us in other ways. During the Gacaca hearings, a boy was kicked out of his family home because he decided to take the risk and bring his father to justice. Because his father had actually killed his childhood friends who used to play with him. And the boy decided that his father wasn't going to go away with it. You know what happened? They didn't only kick him out, they chopped off his hands. You know what happened during the hearings? It was a survivor woman who decided to take him in. It's very costly to take some risk, but in some cases, it's the right way to do. As the time now must be getting close to my time is about to end, I wanted to reiterate a few things, that Gacaca was in no way perfect, but it engaged community participation and made the Rwandans aware of the responsibility they hold to keep each other accountable. This has provided a framework from which other work continues to be done. I give you one small example of a community-based program in which I first participated as a participant in '96. Then I kind of fell in love with it and became a facilitator of the same process. In the last 6 years, I have returned to Rwanda to try to understand the principles of this program and how it operates and its impact in the post-genocide Rwanda. The program is known as the Healing of Life Wounds program. If you have heard me talk, I talk about it all the time because I love it and I think it's amazing. But what the program was founded by that guy I mentioned, Simon Gasibirege, who decided that right in 95, when he returned to Rwanda, he had been in exile for more than 3 decades. He decided to return to Rwanda and start this program. And he insisted that the Hutu and the Tutsi had to come together. Even though he was drawing from different psychological theories he also based on the principle of Gacaca to bring people back together for mutual healing. It's a program that involves the Hutu and the Tutsi together. It emphasizes the shared experience of storytelling and story listening. The Hutus and Tutsi have to sit in the same small groups and talk to one another and share their experiences. But this program has done, I think, what I see as amazing things. Since it started being implemented at the grassroots level of Rwandan communities, Hutus and Tutsi who have attended the program have decided that actually they needed to start organizing a reconciliation day annually. They don't ask for funds from anybody. They contribute their minor money to organize the day, to have people come together, to share the stories of transformation, to share the stories of pain, to use poems, to dance together, to sing together, and at the end of the day, to share a meal together. And contribute so that others who haven't had a chance to participate in that program can access the program. That's one thing that is locally done with no involvement of the government or anybody else. As a participant in it, a facilitator, and now a researcher of this program, and a new Canadian, I have been looking for ways that it can make sense for my new community here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, or even beyond. So I end my presentation on this request from all of us, each one of us. Please find ways to come together, to share those painful stories that colonization and the subsequent policies have created in this country. It is through these shared experiences that we can reconcile as a people and support one another and hold each other accountable. And maybe if we do a good job with that, we can also respond to the call that Cindy Braxton raised last night. How come that people are not rising up when issues of Aboriginal people are concerned? Maybe if we can manage to hold each other accountable, we can start holding our government accountable to do the right thing. Thank you.